5 horses in the race to take the reins of the federal Liberal Party. Who would want it? Who will win? Hello and welcome to the Unpublished Cafe. I'm Ed Hand. Karina Gould, Ruby Dhalla, Frank Baylis, Christia Freeland, and Mark Carney have all made the initial payment of $125,000 of the $350,000 total to enter the race. Our Unpublished.vote question asks you, who do you feel will make the best leader of the Liberal Party for Canada? Gould, Dhalla, Baylis, Freeland, or Carney? You can log on and vote right now at Unpublished.vote. And don't forget to email your MP afterwards using our tool to tell them why you think what you do. All comments on the Unpublished.ca website will be entered into a draw for a 1-year membership to Unpublished.ca. Joining us today to discuss the federal Liberal leadership, Frank Graves of Ekos Research and Jack Jedwab of the Association of Canadian Studies. But first, pleased to be joined by Warren Kinsella, political commentator and former special advisor to Prime Minister Jean Chretien. And Warren, he was last in the race and went to the top with a bullet. What do you think of a Naship with a pocket protector now?
Yeah, the last time we talked, I was poking fun at Mr. Carney, but I'm still going to poke fun at Mr. Carney because his shortcomings remain the same. This is a guy who's never held elected office, ever. So that's a pretty big gap in the, when you're heading into the big leagues, when you're actually about to become Prime Minister of Canada, as he is. And the other problem I think he's got is we don't really know what he stands for. The one thing you and I know about Liberals is Liberals love a winner. And so the early polling showed that Carney was preferable to Freeland. There's a lot of Liberals who are still mad at Freeland for basically taking out Justin Trudeau, as she did at the start of December. So Carney was given an advantage by that, but we don't know how he's going to perform. And, in just a few days' time, Prime Minister Trudeau is going to head off to the lecture circuit. Carney is going to become Prime Minister. He's going to be the first Prime Minister without a seat in the House of Commons since John Turner. That didn't end up particularly well for Mr. Turner. So, I guess the big question, the reason why he's competitive and the Liberal Party is competitive again is Donald Trump. How is Mark Carney going to do against Donald Trump? And that's a question we don't know the answer to.
Well, there was obviously all the polls were pointing to a conservative massive majority, but the latest polls lately might have them a little bit worried what's going on in the conservative war room.
Little bit. They should be really worried. Like, they've done something that I can't recall happening in my lifetime. They've lost a 30-point lead in 6 weeks. Like, if Pierre Poilievre doesn't figure out how to turn this around, and they've got a big gathering of conservatives in Ottawa this week, as you know, and he's got a big speech at the Rogers Centre on Saturday in front of members of his caucus and conservative staff and so on, he better figure out a way to turn this thing around, because he's lost, as I say, 30 points in 6 weeks. That's pretty hard to do, and he's done it. And the main reason isn't really, I think, Mark Carney or Christia Freeland or any of those other people that you named. The main reason is Donald Trump. Canadians have one issue at the moment: who can defend this country against the attacks being made by Donald Trump? And that's why the Liberal Party is competitive again. And that's why the Conservative Party is in some trouble.
It seems when you look at the candidates, those who, Carney's pretty well the only one other than Baylis, really not with Justin Trudeau. And it seems that, Trudeau was stuck, as much as conservatives hate it, is stuck on the other 3 candidates. Can they get Trudeau to stick to Carney to bring him down?
Well, all of the Trudeau team's working for Carney, so that gives him an advantage. So including people within the Liberal Party itself, which is not fair to the other candidates, are working for Carney. And I guess they see a winner in him, and he may well be a winner. But again, as I say, he's an untested candidate, and that's a really dangerous proposition, I think, for the country, because we need somebody who can face off against Donald Trump, who is throwing his weight around the world and threatening to make us the 51st state. He practically does that every single day. So we've had Stephen Harper come out vociferously against Trump, saying that if we have to impoverish ourselves to oppose him, we should do that. We've had Jean Chretien do that. We've had all the former prime ministers, Clark and Campbell and Martin, call on all of us to wave the flag, literally, on Flag Day in the coming days. But, Poilievre has been kind of missing in action. And I think a big part of that is about half of his membership really dig Donald Trump. They think Donald Trump's great. And unfortunately, they're out of step with about 85% of Canadians who hate Donald Trump's guts. So that is why the Conservative Party is losing, is Canadians suspect that the Conservatives led by Poilievre, not the Harper Conservatives, not the Joe Clark Conservatives, but the ones led by Poilievre are much closer to Donald Trump's point of view than they would like.
Now, you're talking about Trump, who was never a politician before 2016, right? Kind of like Mark Carney.
Yeah, but he'd been around for a long time. He knew his way around a microphone. And, I think that Carney, again, I'd love to be wrong, because I do want to have somebody leading this country who can stand off against Trump. But, Carney, we just don't know how he's going to perform. So we're doing a hell of a gamble as a country. We've got one guy who's there, who we know what he's like, and we suspect that he sympathizes with Donald Trump's point of view. And we've got another guy who's never held elected office, and we don't know what his point of view is. And, that's really not the situation that I want for us when at a time of crisis, because we are in a crisis. Donald Trump has said he's going to use economic force against us. He's said that he's made all kinds of lies about fentanyl and banking and dairy products and, the border. And he wants our territory. That's quite obvious. Both Harper and Trudeau have said that. And we need somebody who's going to fight that, who's got strength. And I just don't know if Carney or Poilievre have got what it takes.
The turnaround for the Liberals, at least in terms of what we've seen in the polls, are they just eating the lunch of the NDP right now, or are they starting to pilfer on the Conservatives?
The ballot question has become Donald Trump. The carbon tax stuff that Poilievre was doing for 2 years, it was working for him. The pocketbook stuff was working for him. And then Trump got inaugurated and it started attacking Canada. That has become the ballot question. And so what voters are looking for is the politician who can represent them on that issue. Like, I'll give you an example. Doug Ford leads a Conservative Party in Ontario. Pierre Poilievre leads a Conservative Party federally. One of them has lost 30 points in 6 weeks. The other one is on his way to the biggest majority in Ontario history, having an election in the middle of the winter, having an election early. What is the qualitative difference? Ford is seen as Captain Canada. He's shown that he's prepared to get up in Donald Trump's grill, and Poilievre hasn't done that. And that's the tail of the tape. You can succeed in this environment, but you need to show voters you're prepared to take on Donald Trump.
Do you see any of the Liberal leaderships ever catching Carney at this point?
No, I do not. Freeland, I never thought Freeland had much of a chance. I felt sorry for her because it took guts to take out Trudeau the way she did. But, I subscribe to the old Roman point of view that, Brutus never became emperor. He took out Caesar. But, whoever plays the role of Brutus in politics tends to never get rewarded for that. And I think a lot of Liberals understood why she did what she did, but they don't like that she did the way she did it. And so it always gave Carney a bit of an advantage. And then he's got the old palace guards surrounding him. That may end up hurting him in the fullness of time. We don't know. But right now, he's beating Pierre Poilievre.
While the numbers do bode well for Carney right now, are the Liberals ready for a federal election?
They're getting ready. The Tories have got many more candidates nominated. The Liberals, before this all happened, back at the turn of the year, start of 2025, seems like 10 years ago, the Liberal Party, according to the Angus Reid Institute, was at 16% support. Like, the last time that happened was, when I was working for Mr. Chretien, and Brian Mulroney was down around that level, and his party, when we beat him, ended up getting 2 seats. So they were looking at getting wiped out. A whole bunch of people were talking about leaving, going back to spend more time with their family. I think that's probably now changing. There's probably some liberals saying, okay, not so fast. We actually may pull this off, or we may actually, become a respectably sized opposition under Mark Carney. The question I've got is, if it's opposition for 4 years, does Mark Carney want to stick around?
Yeah, exactly. Warren, I want to thank you for joining us.
Thanks, my friend.
Warren Kinsella is a political commentator and former special advisor to Prime Minister Jean Chretien. When you look at the numbers, there's been a sizable shift in support towards the Liberals federally. Joining us to look a little deeper, I'm pleased to be joined by Frank Graves, president of Ekos Research. And Frank, where is the support coming from?
Well, there's been a pretty dramatic transformation of the political landscape over the past month. One that we started seeing develop in early January, and frankly was treated with a lot of skepticism by others who said they weren't seeing the same thing. But as time went on, and I was very comfortable because we were collecting large samples nightly, and I was looking at them very carefully with all kinds of tests to respond to any of the concerns people have about what might be askew, because it did look very different. The moving average and even our own numbers after Christia Freeland departed cabinet, in the following week, the Conservatives opened up in our polls a 25-point lead, with the Liberals at 19 points, a historical modern low for them. The 18 points for the NDP basically tied, but the Conservatives well ahead in comfortable majority territory at 44 points, 45 points, in that range. Since that time, we saw gradual kind of some movement back, which it picked up a bit after Mr. Trudeau announced his impending resignation. And so a couple of weeks later, that 25-point lead had dropped to 16. But then the following week, we saw some really quite dramatic shifts. Early in the week, I saw the lead declining to 10 points, which, is, as I said, was different from anybody else. But I looked at the numbers every day, and they stayed pretty stable, and there was a pretty plausible explanation for what was going on. Those numbers narrowed, and they continued to narrow. We have the Conservative lead, which was a daunting and apparently insurmountable 25 points only a month ago. It's down to 5 points in our polling right now. And if I put in a prompt on Mr. Carney, I prompted with Christia Freeland as well. In the case of Mr. Carney, that lead basically disappears. There's as many people say I'd vote Liberal as I vote Conservative. So that's a pretty dramatic transformation in a very short period of time. And I have some views from the analysis about what's going on. So I'd be glad to try and explain that and what it might mean. But it's the movements. This is not noise. They all make sense. First of all, a lot of people who were sick of Mr. Trudeau, wanted to change the government, maybe saw an economic advantage with Mr. Poilievre, switched in large numbers. The Liberals a month ago or so were only hanging out at 45% of their vote from the last election, which is pretty terrible. For them, that number has been that group of disaffected Liberals who have moved to the Conservatives. And there was a sizable number, about 13, 14% of NDP as well, who've been attracted to the working class message. And so they also had fueled this rise in Mr. Poilievre's support. That group has been returning for different reasons, but that's the principal source of the growth for the Liberals and the decline. And it's only benefited the Liberals at this point in time because the NDP, which were tied a month ago, and when Mr. Singh was, trumpeting the idea that he would bring down the government at the earliest possible confidence measure, that hasn't worked out very well for him. And I'm not sure that's the only reason, but he's gone from being tied to being 20 points behind. He's like basically in the reeds right now. And if there was an election tomorrow, I'm not sure they'd even form official party status with those numbers, which also kind of changes, even if the Liberals were to think, well, I might be able to eke out a minority, I'm not sure where they look in that new parliament to find any sources of confidence to shore up that government. Apart from that, though, we haven't talked about what I think is the biggest driver of this change. So people, you remove the lightning rod, which was Mr. Trudeau. You have a new leader, Mr. Carney, and possibly Christia Freeland, but it's looking more and more like it'll be the former. And on top of that, though, you had these very, florid announcements, cavalcade almost emerging on a daily basis from our new government to the south, led by President Trump. And these included, what appeared to be perhaps joking, but now more authentic, talk about annexation, tariffs upon tariffs, and then as well, just a whole range of other announcements like turning the Gaza into a resort. Now maybe we'll carve up Ukraine without talking to them. I think these have produced these have produced a lot of trepidation and anxiety in Canadians. And probably at the top of the list, they've spurred a dramatic increase in attachment to country, something which had declined precipitously and had reached a 35-year low in our polling only a month ago. And now we've polled a couple of times since. It's gone up quite dramatically. And that rise is probably the principal engine which is underpinning the newfound competitiveness of the Liberals. Because they now, when we measure this, that party, those supporters, are dramatically more likely to express strong attachment to country than any other party. And I think that's not because, for example, historically NDP would be quite attached to country, but NDP voters who are really attached to the country have abandoned the NDP, partly because they don't look like they're going to be a viable option in the next election. And secondly, because they thought that the Liberals were better poised to respond to this challenge to our national identity. So those are, I think, the main forces going on, and where they go from here is really hard to say, but this is a hugely different voter landscape in a short period of time than what we would have seen, as they say at the beginning of the year.
Yeah. Now, in terms of leadership candidates, it seems that any of the candidates that were linked to Trudeau, so Freeland, Gould, Dhalla, they don't quite have the support of, obviously, Mark Carney.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's the factor, but yes, that's true. I think Mr. Carney, and we saw this movement up, this sharp movement up a few weeks ago, really after he had his launch, and in particular, that viral show on the morning show or whatever in the States, what 1.6 million viewers, daily show rather. And there would seem to be the sense that, wow, he isn't this stiff technocrat. He looks like he's got a sense of humor, and he seems, we're kind of reminded about his accomplishments as the governor of the Bank of Canada and having the same position in the UK. So I think he's kind of seems to have opened up, at least in our polling, when we ask voters, are you more likely to vote for the Liberals? And we give them the option of Christia Freeland or Mark Carney. Frankly, the others aren't factors. And in the case of Mr. Carney, the net positives are in the range of 10%. In other words, about 10% of voters say, I'd be more likely to vote Liberal. And the Liberals are already narrowed this gap dramatically. If Mr. Carney, and in the case of Christia Freeland, that's not happening. There's actually a net negative. So we'll see if that's not how we pick leadership candidates, but it would seem if we were picking them in terms of the potential positive impact on the prospects for the party being successful in the next election, Mr. Carney has a pretty overwhelming advantage at this stage, and there's not much time left. So we'll see what happens there.
If the Liberals continue this trajectory, what's the story for the Bloc and its success in Quebec?
Well, that's an interesting point, and I'm glad you brought it up, because that's the other. I talked about the other main changes. The main changes are, of course, the narrowing gap between the Liberals and the Conservatives. But the precipitous fall of the NDP is another major story, which is not as clearly understood. The other one is the Bloc. The Bloc, at that same time that the Liberals were at 19 points, In Quebec, we're at 40 points, which meant that they would be the official opposition. That, and I'm not entirely clear of what's going on there, but I suspect it's linked to, and I have some of the data which suggests that they're alarmed by what's going on in the United States. And there may be that Quebecers who like, stronger social programs and a more, muscular government than certainly the models that are being proposed by the populists in the United States are looking now with more suspicion at what Mr. Carney's offering. That's another side effect of all this. I think the display of what's going on in the United States is making people have maybe a second look at the populist component of Mr. Poilievre's constituency, which is the largest component, about 25%, who are, exhibit this kind of ordered personality outlook. They're disinformed, they're angry, they like the freedom convoy. Interesting enough, they were joined by another group of 20% of voters who didn't share those characteristics at all. They were just sick of Mr. Trudeau and might have wanted better economic policies. But in Quebec, I think the fallout for the Bloc is not because of anything they've done. It's an alarm, I think, that Quebecers have about what's going on in the United States and Mr. Trump. And I think that seems to bolster the Liberals' fortune. Although I would say I would rate the Quebec race as highly unpredictable this time, but it's pretty clear they're not buying what Mr. Trump is offering. And by the way, Quebecers are typically more favorably disposed to the United States than other Canadians. Not at all times. They certainly weren't in the lead up to the Gulf War, for example, but more often than not, they would look favorably at the United States. Most Canadians would normally look favorably at the United States. The incidence of Canadians who rate our relationship with the United States positively right now, which was 70% a year ago, it's now 9%. It's been an incredibly steep decline. And when I asked favorability ratings for Mr. Trump, President Trump rather, his favorability rating is 18%, which isn't very good, but I found it surprisingly high. What's interesting is if you break that down on partisan lines, amongst conservative voters, there's almost equal numbers say I'm favorably impressed as unfavorably. If you look at, for example, Liberal supporters, this is true of most of the other part of the spectrum other than the People's Party, that number's 2%. So there's this yawning gulf on many, many issues, including, as I mentioned, do you think the Freedom Convoy is a good thing? Same kinds of massive gulfs, disinformation, appeal of populism. And I think what that's done is it's shaken loose a lot of this more moderate status quo conservative portion of Mr. Poilievre's vote. And at this point, it's landing with the Liberals. And I we'll see where it goes from here. But it's definitely not just something that's some ephemeral dead cat bounce. It's a real effect, and it's and dramatically changed the prospects for the next election, whatever that might be, which is a really interesting question, because I think voters have some different views on that, depending on who they're supporting. And also, if the rumors that Mr. Carney would like to dissolve Parliament immediately after what I think will be a successful leadership run, that may clash with a number of factors, not the least of being the people who would vote for him don't want to see election right away. They think we're in a crisis. They're right. And they don't necessarily want to see us kind of losing whatever kind of functioning government we have for a period of whatever it would be, 8 weeks in the middle of a crisis. And if they link that to the only reason you're doing that, because you see a political opportunity, that might backfire. So I think that would be something to watch closely.
Alberta's long complained they're treated as outsiders because most of the federal leaders come from the East. Does Mark Carney break that mold?
He's doing somewhat better in Alberta, but that's going to be a tough hill to climb right now. And I'd like to point out that a lot of that Western alienation, which is focused historically in Alberta, and now I'd say Saskatchewan as well, is different from the kind of alienation and dissatisfaction with Canada you would have seen in Quebec. I think Quebecers actively entertained, well, let's just leave the country, and they came damn close to doing that in 1995, fully aware of what that would mean. In Alberta, I think the desire to leave the country, which is higher today than it is normally, but still not anything close to what it would be to support a referendum, it is also not based on the same disaffection for the country. I think it was Roger Gibbons, who used to be in charge of the Canada West Foundation, very smart guy, noted sagely that Albertans and Westerners were not really that interested in leaving the country. They were frustrated Canadian nationalists. They like Canada. They just wish it looked more like what their interpretation what a Canada should look like, which is interesting because in the Stephen Harper period, which went on for a long time, all that stuff dissipated because it did look more like what Albertans want. So I suspect a lot of this current kind of, although there's some different flavor to some of the outlook on Canada today in the United States, than there was in the past with this, new kind of debate about should we become the 51st state? Should we be more compliant and accommodating to Mr. Trump? Do you see Mr. Trump, President Trump rather, as threatening or possibly as an asset? The views on that are very different in Alberta as they are in the rest of the country, which is also very true about the difference across Conservatives and other voters. One of the reasons the Conservatives are, in an astronomical level in Alberta, which is not particularly seat efficient for them. They would win every seat in Alberta and Saskatchewan twice, but they're only available once. So they waste some of their vote, which is why the national numbers in terms of popular vote might obscure the fact that regionally, with how the Liberals are doing in Ontario and Quebec, Atlantic, and better in BC, it would be, even without putting in a factor adjusting for the preference for Mr. Carney, it would be a pretty hard race to predict the outcome. It would be really damn close.
Frank, I want to thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. I hope some of that made sense.
Frank Graves is president of Ekos Research. Canada is in bizarre times. Our largest trading partner is turning away from us. Jack Jedwab is president of the Association of Canadian Studies, and he joins us now. And Jack, there seems to be a resurgence in patriotism in Canada. What took it so long?
Well, I think that we've been busy in a very deep introspection about our country for 10 years, in particular, with respect to Indigenous issues, I would suggest to a considerable degree, where we've gone into a whole process of self-examination, self-criticism. And I think some of that has affected our ability to display our patriotism. It's created a lot of debates about who we are and what our sort of historic record looks like. But it took the threat from Donald Trump to enable us to move some of those considerations to the side for the time being and remind ourselves that there's something here that we really value and that we want to defend against the threat to our identity as it's being positioned, or if you'd like, or carried out by the Trump administration.
How do you see this impacting the Liberal leadership race?
I think it's going to have an important impact on the Liberal leadership race if things continue the way they have been. I think initially a lot of Canadians weren't taking the threat from President Trump seriously. Now we're seeing a bit more of the seriousness attached to it as the U.S. president continues to say he's interested in us becoming the 51st state, and no one seems to be contradicting that. So I think that's meaning, or the implication of that is that it's putting that issue on the agenda. And look, there's some concrete measures with respect to tariffs that are having a profound impact on our relationship with the U.S., causing us to think about that relationship in ways that we haven't necessarily done recently under the Biden administration. And so, we'll have to see what that means from an electoral standpoint. Certainly, it's going to be on the agenda if nothing is resolved in the course of the next 30 days or so. I suspect we'll have elections reasonably soon after the Liberal leadership is determined. So, yeah, I fully think that it will be on the agenda.
Can you think back to a time when Canada has had such a rocky road with the U.S.?
Yeah, 1812, but it's a bit before my time, substantially so. But we've had our differences with respect to economic ties, some migration bumps, so to speak. But by and large, people like to think of our relationship and the undefended border for 200 years as one that really is an example for a lot of other countries with very challenging borders and disputes accompanying that. That's not been the nature of our relationship, although we've had some bumps, and clearly we've had some bumps with respect to commercial issues and trade. But overall, no, the relationship has been relatively smooth. So this is a different path, presumably, but we'll have to see, whether the rhetoric translates into reality. Because in the case of Donald Trump, some of the rhetoric doesn't translate into reality, and some of it clearly does. And we'll have to see what the meaning of this is. But clearly, it's an opportunity for us to reflect on our relationship with our bigger neighbor to the south.
Do you think this is going to blow over?
I think that the idea of annexing us will blow over, but the idea of what our relationship looks like commercially, and what our relationship looks like with respect to borders and migration and a range of other issues, and what it means for our economy is probably not going to blow over, because the sort of America First idea that Trump is pursuing is something that's got to impact us, particularly in this sort of edition of Trump 2.0, where he seems to be a lot more aggressive in terms of his behavior and putting out a lot of those presidential decrees, which seem to overcome, if you like, the normal process and discussion that you'd have in terms of reaching agreements and resolutions on issues where there are differences.
Canada has the largest diaspora of Ukrainian people outside of Ukraine. The Ukraine war, obviously, a very key issue right now. What do you see as the end game with Ukraine?
I mean, it's hard to say, because Trump, in the last 24 hours, is in talks with, or seemingly has come to some conclusion in his conversations with Putin that isn't very favorable to Ukraine's situation, and basically is ceding, if we understand correctly, to Russia a lot of what it is after. So that's not good for relations with either Ukraine or the European Union, and certainly will upset a lot of Ukrainians in Canada, and should upset a lot of Canadians in general, if that's the approach that Mr. Trump has taken, and the results follow. One hopes that it's not what happens over the next few days, because I think we'll see reasonably soon what the outcome of all this is. But certainly it will make a lot of Canadians unhappy, and I'd like to think there'll be a lot of Americans as well who will be unhappy about this outcome. But America is a very polarized place right now, and I think there is a sense that if these wars can be put to an end, Mr. Trump will probably do well with his following, independent of how these conflicts end up terminating and who pays what price.
If that's the case, then what's the result for NATO?
Well, I don't think it's a good result for NATO, and it's paradoxical, because, a lot of observers thought that with globalization, you would be increasingly living in a world where borders didn't matter as much, but clearly borders seem to matter more than ever, despite all the globalization and the facility of communicating across those borders does not seem to undercut strong national sentiment, which we're seeing expressed in a lot of elections around a lot of parts of the world right now, including in Europe. So we'll have to see what it all means. One would like to think, out of all this exhaustive discussion and headbutting, that something good will come out of it, because it is contributing to a much larger reflection about our relationships and about where we all stand globally. Will something come good out of that? Something good come out of that, rather? I hope so, but I'm not sure.
Jack, I want to thank you for joining us.
No problem, Ed. Thank you. Take care.
Jack Jedwab is the president of the Association of Canadian Studies. Our Unpublished.vote question asks, who do you feel will make the best leader of the Liberal Party for Canada? Gould, Dhalla, Baylis, Freeland, or Carney? You can log on and vote right now, and don't forget to email your MP afterwards using our tool to tell them why you think what you do. All comments on the unpublished.ca website will be entered into a draw for a one-year membership to unpublished.ca. I want to thank our guests today on the Unpublished Cafe, Warren Kinsella, Frank Graves, and Jack Jedwab. And thank you for watching. I'm Ed Hand.